The diplomatic vessel S-Harmony drifted through the endless void of space, carrying humanity's hope toward a world that had existed long before. Earth had formed its first ocean. Ethan Cole stood near the observation window, his reflection a ghost against the stars. And he wondered for the 100th time why they had chosen him for this mission. He was only 24 years old, the youngest human ever assigned to an interstellar diplomatic delegation. And he still could not believe that he was actually here. The Valkyrie Empire ruled over 900 worlds, and their empress had governed for 4,000 years, which meant she had been ancient when humans were still learning to make fire. Nervous? Asked Ambassador Chun, stepping beside him with a knowing smile. Terrified, Ethan admitted, because there was no point in lying to a woman who had spent 30 years reading people across species lines. Good, she said. That means you understand what we are walking into. The Harmony began its descent toward the throne world, and Ethan watched as the planet grew larger in the window, its surface covered in crystalline structures that caught the light of 3 suns and scattered it into rainbows that stretched across continents. He had studied the Valkyrie for months, learning their language and customs and history, but nothing had prepared him for the beauty of their home. The shuttle carried them down through clouds that shimmered like liquid silver, and when they landed on a platform of polished obsidian, Ethan had to remind himself to breathe. Guards stood waiting for them, tall and elegant beings with features that blended the familiar and the alien in ways that made his mind struggle to process what he was seeing. They had 4 arms and skin that shifted colors with their emotions, and their eyes held the weight of centuries in their depths. "Welcome to the throne world," one of them said in perfect English, though their mouth moved in patterns that did not match the words. "The Empress awaits your presence in the Hall of Eternal Stars." The walk to the palace took them through gardens where flowers sang in frequencies that Ethan could feel in his bones, and past fountains that flowed upward instead of down, defying gravity through technologies that humans could not even begin to understand. He kept his face neutral and his step steady, but inside he was a storm of wonder and fear. The Hall of Eternal Stars lived up to its name in ways that stole the breath from his lungs. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, and somehow the architects had captured actual starlight within its surface, creating a map of the galaxy that glowed with soft and ancient fire. Thousands of Valkyrie nobles filled the hall, their whispers creating a sound like wind through alien forests. And every single one of them turned to watch the humans enter. Ethan felt their judgment like a physical weight pressing down on him. To them, humans were barely more than clever animals, a species that had crawled out of their caves mere moments ago in the grand timeline of galactic history. They saw short lives and chaotic minds and bodies that broke so easily, and they wondered why the Empress had even bothered to invite such creatures to her court. The throne sat at the far end of the hall, raised on a platform of what looked like frozen lightning, and upon it sat Empress Zadara Valkosh. Was magnificent in a way that transcended physical beauty, her presence filling the room like a force of nature given form. Her skin shifted through shades of deep purple and midnight blue, and her forearms rested on the throne with the casual grace of absolute power. But it was her eyes that caught Ethan and held him prisoner. They were silver, bright as moons, and they contained depths that spoke of millennia spent watching empires rise and fall. Ambassador Chan began the formal greeting, her words carefully chosen according to protocols that had been negotiated over years of careful diplomacy. Ethan stood with the other junior members of the delegation, trying to be invisible, trying to be forgettable, trying to be anything other than the youngest and most inexperienced person in the room. The Empress listened to the ambassador's words with an expression that revealed nothing. And when she spoke, her voice resonated through the hall like music played on instruments that had never existed on Earth. "Humanity seeks friendship with the Valkyrie Empire," she said. And it was not a question, but a statement that demanded confirmation. "We do." "Your Eternal Majesty," Ambassador Chun replied, "we believe that our peoples have much to offer each other." A ripple of amusement passed through the assembled nobles, and Ethan did not need a translator to understand their contempt. What could humans possibly offer beings who had mastered the stars when humanity was still learning to walk upright? The formal reception continued with exchanges of gifts and promises and carefully worded treaties. And Ethan did his job as a junior cultural attache, answering questions about human customs when senior members of the delegation needed support. He explained why humans shook hands and why they smiled to show friendship and why they wrote stories about impossible things. One noble asked him about human literature, her tone suggesting that she expected the answer to be amusing in its primitiveness. "We write about hope," Ethan said. And without thinking, he looked directly at the Empress as he spoke. "We write about ordinary people who face impossible odds and refuse to surrender. Because that is who we are." The hall went silent in Velkari culture. Direct eye contact with the Empress was either a grave insult or a bold challenge. A declaration that the one who dared to look was claiming equality with the ruler of 900 worlds. Ambassador Chen's face went pale, and Ethan realized his mistake a heartbeat too late. But the Empress did not call for his execution. Instead, she leaned forward on her throne, and something shifted in her silver eyes. Something that looked almost like wonder. "Come closer," she commanded. And her voice left no room for disobedience. Ethan walked forward on legs that trembled, and he climbed the steps to stand before the most powerful being in this quarter of the galaxy. She studied him with an intensity that made him feel like she was reading every secret his soul had ever kept. And then her eyes widened, and a gasp escaped her lips, and she spoke words in the ancient tongue of her people that made every noble in the hall drop to their knees. "The soul thread," someone whispered, and the words spread through the crowd like fire. The Empress rose from her throne, and she was tall, so much taller than him. And she looked down at this young human with an expression that mixed shock and joy, and something that might have been the beginning of obsession. "He shall be mine," she proclaimed, her voice ringing through the hall like a bell announcing the end of one age and the beginning of another. "By blood and star, I invoke the right of eternal bond." Chaos erupted around them as diplomats shouted and nobles protested and guards moved to contain the confusion. But Ethan stood frozen, unable to look away from the silver eyes of the Empress. And he understood with terrible clarity that his life as he knew it had just ended. The youngest human in the galaxy had just been claimed as the consort of its most powerful ruler, and nothing would ever be the same again. 2 weeks had passed since the Empress spoke those words that turned Ethan's world inside out, and he still woke each morning, expecting to discover that it had all been some strange dream. But the golden walls of his quarters reminded him that this was real, and the guards outside his door confirmed that he was neither guest nor prisoner, but something in between. The rooms they had given him were larger than his entire apartment back on Earth, filled with furniture that adjusted to his body and windows that could show him any view in the Empire. It was a beautiful cage. And Ethan spent most of his time trying to understand the bar's Ambassador Chen visited him when she could, bringing news from Earth and sympathy that she could not fully express with Valkyrie servants always listening. "The government is divided," she told him during one of these visits, her voice low and careful. "Some see you as an opportunity, a human at the heart of Valkyrie power who could reshape everything. And the others?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. "They want you home," she said. "They call this kidnapping and demand your return. Even if it means war," Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Because the idea of Earth going to war with an empire that had existed for 50,000 years was not brave, but suicidal. "Tell them I am fine," he said. "Tell them I am learning, and tell them that I will find a way through this that does not end with our species becoming a footnote in Valkyrie history. The courtship sessions began on the third day. Formal meetings where the Empress and her claimed were supposed to learn each other according to traditions. Older than human civilization, Ethan expected to meet a cold and distant ruler who saw him as a possession rather than a person. But what he found instead surprised him in ways he was still trying to understand. Zithar was lonely. He saw it in the moments between formal words, in the way her silver eyes softened when he asked questions that no one else dared to ask, in the careful way she watched him as if trying to memorize something precious and fragile. "You are not what I expected," she told him during their fifth session, her voice stripped of the formal tone she used in court. "What did you expect?" Ethan asked. "Fear," she said. "Submission. Perhaps attempts to escape or bargain for freedom. But you sit there and ask me about my favorite color and whether I have ever seen a sunset on a world with only one sun. I am afraid," Ethan admitted, because lying to someone who could probably read his emotions like a book seemed pointless. "But fear does not help me understand, and understanding is the only tool I have." Something flickered across her face, an expression he had learned to recognize as Valkyrie surprise, and she leaned forward with curiosity burning bright in her ancient eyes. "You want to understand me?" "I want to understand everything," he said. "That is what humans do when we are scared and confused and completely out of our depth. We ask questions and we learn and we adapt." "Fascinating," she whispered. And the word was not mockery, but genuine wonder. Their conversations grew longer and deeper as the days passed, and Ethan discovered that the Empress was not the untouchable goddess her people believed her to be. She had doubts and fears and dreams that she could never share with the scheming nobles who surrounded her throne. She told him about the burden of ruling for 4,000 years, watching generations of her people live and die while she remained unchanged, carrying the weight of decisions that affected billions of lives. "They see the crown," she said one evening, the light of 3 moons painting her skin in shades of silver. "They see the power and the glory and the history, but they never see me." "I see you," Ethan said. And he meant it. The court watched their interactions with hungry eyes. And not all of those eyes were friendly. Lord Cathvora was the leader of the traditionalist faction, a noble whose family had served the throne for 20,000 years and who believed that alien contamination of the royal bloodline was an abomination that could not be permitted. He gathered all eyes in shadowed corners of the palace, speaking of purity and tradition, and the shame of seeing their empress lower herself to claim a creature whose entire species had existed for less time than his mourning. Meditations. Ethan learned about the danger from an unexpected source. Alitha was a servant of the lowest caste, assigned to clean his quarters and bring his meals. And by Valkyrie custom, she was supposed to be invisible, a tool that walked and breathed but held no more importance than a piece of furniture. But Ethan had never been good at treating people like objects. "Thank you," he said the first time she brought him food, and she froze as if he had spoken words of power. "You do not thank servants," she whispered, her eyes wide with confusion. "On Earth we do," he said. "On Earth we believe that every person has value, regardless of what job they do or what family they were born into." She stared at him for a long moment, and then something changed in her expression. A crack in the mask she wore to survive in a world that told her she was worthless. Over the following days, Litha began to speak to him, sharing small pieces of information about the palace and its politics. And it was she who warned him about Kethvorin. "He has hired assassins," she said, her voice trembling with fear. "Blade dancers from the outer reaches who have never failed to kill their targets." "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan asked. "You could be executed for speaking to me this way." "Because you thanked me," she said. And there were tears in her compound eyes, because you asked my name and remembered it. Because you look at me like I am a person and not a shadow. Ethan reached out and took her hand. A gesture that would scandalize every noble in the palace. And he squeezed it gently. I will not forget your kindness, he promised that night. Zidara came to him in his quarters. Not for a formal session, but because she had heard rumors that disturbed her. Tell me about Earth, she asked, sitting beside him in a chair that was far too simple for an empress. Tell me about your people and how they live their brief, bright lives. So Ethan told her about oceans that stretched, to horizons and forests that changed colors with the seasons and cities that glowed with light against the darkness of night. He told her about love and loss and the way humans found beauty in impermanence because they knew that everything ended. He told her about his family, his mother who worked as a teacher and his father who fixed machines with hands that could make anything work, and his little sister who dreamed of seeing the stars. You miss them, Zidara said. And it was not a question every day, Ethan admitted. But missing them does not mean I regret being here. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers cool against his skin, and her silver eyes held an emotion that he had never seen in them before. The soul thread is real, she said softly. I feel it between us like a cord of light. But I want you to know that I will not force you to complete the bond. Ethan stared at her, unable to speak, because this was not what he had expected from a being who had conquered worlds and commanded armies. I have taken many things in my long life, she continued, but I will not take your choice. Not in this. Before he could respond, the windows exploded inward, and dark figures poured into the room with blades that gleamed with poison. The assassins had come, and Ethan had only seconds to live, but Litha was there, having followed the Empress to deliver a message. And she threw herself between Ethan and the killing stroke without hesitation. The blade meant for him found her instead, and she crumpled to the ground with a smile on her face. Because she had finally done something that mattered. Ethan caught her as she fell, and something inside him shattered, and something else awakened. Light exploded from his body. A wave of psychic energy that threw the assassins against the walls and held them there like insects pinned to a board. Zidara watched with eyes that had grown wide as moons. Because what she was seeing should have been impossible. Humans did not have psychic abilities. Everyone knew that, but the power pouring from this young man was undeniable and terrifying and beautiful all at once. The guards arrived to find Ethan kneeling on the floor with Litha dead in his arms and tears streaming down his face and power crackling around him like a storm that had found its center. The soul thread is not just connecting us, Zidara whispered, understanding flooding through her ancient mind. It is awakening something in you. Ethan looked up at her, and his eyes glowed with light that had never existed in human eyes before. And he spoke words that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. She died for me, he said. She was worth nothing to your people, and she gave everything. And I will not let her sacrifice mean nothing. In that moment, the Empress of the Velkari Empire realized that she had not claimed a possession, she had claimed a force of nature. The aftermath of the assassination attempt changed everything in ways that rippled through the palace like waves through still waters. Zidara executed the surviving assassins publicly, her voice cold as the void between stars as she pronounced their deaths. And then she declared that any who threatened the life of her claimed would face the same fate. High Lord Kethvorin watched from the crowd with murder in his eyes. But he was too smart to show his involvement and too powerful to be accused without proof. The palace became a fortress, and Ethan became its most protected treasure. But he refused to hide in his quarters and tremble at shadows. I need to understand what is happening to me, he demanded when Zidara visited him the morning after the attack. I need to control this power before it controls me. She studied him with those silver eyes that had seen the birth and death of civilizations. And she nodded slowly. "The soul thread has awakened something that should not exist," she said. "Humans are not supposed to have psychic potential. Yet I felt the power that exploded from you. And it was stronger than anything I have sensed in centuries. How is that possible?" "I do not know," she admitted, and the admission clearly cost her pride. "But I will find out, and in the meantime, my personal guard will teach you what they can." The training began that same day, and it was brutal. Commander Vexal was the leader of the Empress's elite guards, a warrior who had fought in 100 campaigns and killed more enemies than Ethan could count. And she looked at the young human with undisguised skepticism. "Show me what you did," she ordered. Standing in a training hall that hummed with contained energy, Ethan tried to reach for the power he had felt the night before, but it was like grasping at smoke, slipping through his mental fingers no matter how hard he concentrated. "I cannot find it," he said after an hour of failed attempts. "Because you are trying to find it the wrong way," Vexal said, her tone sharp with frustration. Valkyrie access their psychic abilities through meditation and control, through the suppression of emotion and the achievement of perfect mental stillness. "That is not how it happened before," Ethan said, remembering the moment when the power had erupted from him. "It happened when I was angry and sad and desperate. When I felt everything at once." Vexal exchanged a look with her subordinates, and Ethan could read the doubt in their expressions. But he knew he was right, because he had felt the truth of it in his bones. Humans did not suppress their emotions. They experienced them fully. They let themselves be transformed by joy and grief and rage and love. That was what made them human. And that was what had awakened the power. "Let me try something," he said. And he closed his eyes and thought about Lythe, remembered her smile when he thanked her, the wonder in her eyes when he asked her name, the fear in her voice when she warned him about the assassins. He remembered the moment she threw herself in front of the blade. And he let himself feel the grief of her loss fully and completely. The power answered light gathered around his hands, crackling with an energy that made the air taste like lightning. And when he opened his eyes, even Vexal took a step back. "Impossible," she whispered. "Not impossible," Ethan said, and his voice carried harmonics that had not been there before. "Just human." The weeks that followed became a strange routine of training and learning and growing closer to the Empress, who had claimed him. Ethan discovered that his psychic abilities were fundamentally different from those of the Valkyrie, powered by emotion rather than suppression, chaotic and unpredictable, but devastatingly effective when he learned to channel them. The Valkyrie technique of perfect stillness did nothing for him. But when he let himself feel the full weight of his human heart, the power responded like a storm answering the call of the wind scholars, came from across the empire to study him. And they left with more questions than answers. "Your species has latent psychic potential that was never activated," one of them theorized after scanning his brain with technologies that humans would not develop for another 1,000 years. "Something about your neural pattern suppresses it. But the soul thread with the Empress has created a pathway that bypasses that suppression." "What does that mean?" Ethan asked. "It means that any human who forms a deep enough bond with a psychically active species could potentially awaken the same abilities," the scholar said, and his compound eyes glittered with implications that stretched across centuries. Ethan sent a secret message to Earth through Ambassador Chun, warning them about what he had discovered. "I do not know what this means for our people," he wrote, "but I know that we are not what the galaxy thinks we are, and when they realize that, everything will change." His relationship with Zidara deepened in ways that surprised them both. She showed him the hidden gardens that only she could access, a paradise of alien flowers and singing fountains where she went to escape the weight of her crown. "I have ruled alone for 4,000 years," she told him as they walked through. Groves of trees that glowed with inner light. I have had advisors and generals and nobles who sought my favor, but never a companion. Never someone who saw me as something other than power wearing a face. Must be lonely, Ethan said. I did not know how lonely until I met you, she replied. And her voice held a vulnerability that she had never shown anyone else. He told her about his dreams for the future, about his hope that humans and Velkari could build something new together. A partnership between the oldest empire and the youngest species that could reshape the galaxy. She listened with the attention of someone who had long stopped believing that the future could hold anything she had not already seen, but when he spoke, she found herself believing again. You humans are strange, she said one evening as they watched the three suns set in colors that had no names in any human language. You live such brief lives, yet you dream bigger than species that have existed for millions of years. Because we know we do not have time to be small, Ethan said. Every dream matters, because we might not get another chance to dream it. I think, she said slowly, as if testing words she had never spoken before, that I am beginning to love you. Ethan turned to look at her. This ancient being of impossible power and terrible loneliness. And he realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped being afraid. I think I am beginning to love you too, he said, but their moment of peace was shattered when a messenger arrived with news that made Zithra's expression turned to Ice High Lord Kethvoran had gathered 5 noble houses to challenge her right to take an alien consort, and by ancient law that even the Empress could not ignore. The matter had to be settled by the trial of dominion. What does that mean? Ethan asked, seeing the concern that Zithara tried to hide behind her mask of royal calm. It means I must fight, she said. 5 champions, 1 from each house, in consecutive combat, and if I fall, the bonding will be dissolved, and you will be cast out or killed. That is not fair, Ethan said, anger rising in his chest. You are the Empress. Surely you can refuse. The trial is sacred, she replied. It is how disputes were settled in the time before words. And no ruler can refuse without losing the respect of every noble house in the empire. Ethan watched her face, seeing the calculations running behind her silver eyes as she assessed the odds and found them troubling. You could die, he said. It is possible, she admitted. 5 champions, each one fresh while I grow more tired with every battle. The math is not in my favor. Something ignited in Ethan's chest. A fire that had been building since the moment Litha died in his arms. And he spoke before he could talk himself out of it. Then I will stand with you, he said. The ancient texts mention a role called the Second, a position where the claimed can fight alongside their bonded. Zithara stared at him with shock painted across her features. Because no alien had ever held such a position in all the history of her people. You would die, she said. The champions they choose will be the finest warriors in the Empire. And you have only weeks of training. Maybe, Ethan agreed. But I would rather die fighting beside you than live knowing I hid while you faced danger alone. Why? She asked, and the question was not accusation but genuine confusion. The incomprehension of a being who had never known someone willing to sacrifice for her. Because that is what humans do. Ethan said, when we love someone, we stand with them, even against impossible odds. Even when we know we cannot win. Zithara was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice trembled with emotions that she had not felt in millennia. You foolish, brave, impossible human, she whispered. I will take that as a yes, Ethan said with a smile that hid the terror in his heart. The challenge was accepted, and word spread across the empire that the Empress's human claimed would stand as her second in the trial of dominion in the halls of power. Nobles whispered about the audacity of this alien creature who dared to think he could survive against Velkari warriors in the lower quarters. Servants and workers who had heard stories about the human who treated them as equals prayed to gods. They barely believed in that he might somehow survive, and in his chambers, Ethan Cole of Earth prepared for the fight of his life, knowing that the fate of everything he loved depended on what happened in the arena high. Lord Kethvorin smiled when he heard the news, because he had already chosen himself as the 5th champion. The Arena of Eternity had stood for 100,000 years, its walls carved from stone that remembered the birth of the Valkyrie Empire. And today, it would witness something that had never happened in all that Tima. Human would fight for the right to stand beside an Empress. Billions watched across 900 worlds as the ceremonies began, their eyes fixed on screens that showed every angle of the ancient arena. Ethan stood in the preparation chamber, his hands wrapped in the traditional binding of a second, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. "You do not have to do this," Zadara said, standing before him in armor that had been worn by 12 generations of her bloodline. "Even now, you could withdraw, and I would fight alone as I have always fought." Ethan looked at her, this magnificent being who had ruled an empire before his species learned to speak. And he shook his head. "Humans have a saying," he told her. "The measure of a person is what they will stand for, and I am standing for you, for us. For the idea that the galaxy can be different than it has always been." She stepped closer and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of intimacy that Valkyrie only shared with their bonded. And when she pulled back, her silver eyes were bright with something. "That might have been tears. Then let us show them what we are," she said. The arena was filled with the roar of crowds that stretched up toward a sky, painted in the colors of a dying day. And when Ethan walked out beside the Empress, the sound changed to gasps and whispers and shouts of outrage. He was so small compared to the Valkyrie warriors who waited on the other side of the sand, so fragile-looking with his soft human skin and his single pair of arms. The first champion stepped forward, a veteran of the warrior caste named Thalvik, who had killed enemies across a dozen campaigns, and who looked at Ethan the way a predator looks at prey. "I claim the first challenge," Thalvik announced, his voice booming through the arena, "and I will end this farce before it begins." Ethan walked to meet him, and every step felt like walking toward his own grave. The rules of the trial were simple: fight until one could no longer stand, with no killing strikes permitted unless the opponent refused to yield. But everyone knew that accidents happened in combat, and no one would mourn if the human died from an unfortunate wound. Thalvik attacked without warning, his forearms wielding blades that sang through the air faster than Ethan could track. And for the first few seconds, all Ethan could do was stumble backward and try not to die. The crowd laughed at the spectacle of this pitiful creature, barely managing to stay alive. But Ethan was learning humans had evolved as persistent predators, hunters who chased their prey across endless distances until exhaustion claimed what speed could not. And that same stubbornness lived in every fiber of his being. He stopped trying to match Thalvik's speed and started watching his patterns instead, noting the way the warrior favored his upper right arm and how he always stepped forward with the same foot before a major strike. "You are only delaying the inevitable," Thalvik snarled after failing to land a clean hit for the 10th time. "Maybe," Ethan said. And then he did something no Valkyrie would ever expect. He attacked not with skill or grace or anything resembling proper technique, but with the reckless abandon of a human who had decided that dying on his feet was better than dying on his knees. Thalvik was so surprised by the sudden shift that he failed to block the strike that crashed into his knee. And when he stumbled, Ethan was already moving, abandoning any pretense of defense to hammer blows against every vulnerable point he could reach. It was ugly and desperate and completely against every principle of Valkyrie combat, and it worked. Thalvik fell, unable to stand on a leg that had been struck a dozen times in the same spot. And Ethan stood over him with blood running from a dozen cuts and his chest heaving with exhaustion. The arena went silent then. From somewhere in the lower sections where the common people sat, a single voice began to cheer. And others joined it until a wave of sound rolled across the arena that had nothing to do with the nobles who watched from their privileged seats. Ethan looked up at the stands and saw faces that he recognized. Servants and workers and all the forgotten people who had heard stories about the human, who treated them like being mattered. They were cheering for him. Zithora moved past him with fire in her eyes. And she faced the next three champions with the fury of a storm that had been waiting centuries to break. Free, the second champion, fell in minutes. Overwhelmed by an empress who fought not just for her throne, but for something she had thought she would never have again. Hope, the third, lasted longer, but could not withstand the ancient techniques that Zithora had perfected over millennia. The fourth was young and fast and nearly managed to wound her. But Zithora had been fighting since before his great-grandparents were born. An experience won over youth as it always did, but the battles had taken their toll when the fourth champion finally yielded. Zithora was breathing hard and bleeding from wounds that her armor had failed to stop. And everyone could see that she was weakening. High Lord Cathvoran stepped into the arena with a smile that promised pain, and his eyes flickered to Ethan with the confidence of someone who had already written the ending of this story. "How fitting," he said as he approached, "that I will be the one to end this abomination. The human will watch you fall, and then I will take great pleasure in showing him what happens to animals who forget their place." Zithora raised her weapons, but everyone could see the way her arms trembled from exhaustion. This was what Cathvoran had planned all along, letting others weaken her before he stepped in for the killing blow. Ethan watched from the edge of the arena, and something inside him refused to accept this ending. He had been told to stay back, had promised to only fight if directly challenged. But there were some promises that humans were not built to keep. He stepped between Cathvoran and Zithora, placing himself directly in the path of the most dangerous warrior he had ever faced. "Move aside," Cathvoran said, and his voice dripped with contempt. "This is between the Empress and myself. You have no part in this anymore. A second can challenge for their bonded if she cannot continue," Ethan said, pulling the words from memories of ancient texts he had studied in preparation for this moment. "I invoke that right." Whispers erupted through the arena as people realized what he was doing. "You cannot even stand properly," Cathvoran said, gesturing at the wounds that covered Ethan's body from his earlier fight. "What can you possibly hope to accomplish?" Ethan met the noble's eyes with a gaze that held no fear, only the terrible certainty of someone who had already decided to die for what he believed in. "I can stand between you and her," he said, and his voice carried across the arena in the sudden silence. "And you will have to kill me to move me, and then you will have to kill the next human who comes. And the next. That is what we do. We do not stop. We never stop." Cathvoran hesitated. It was not fear of Ethan that made him pause, but something in the human's eyes that he did not understand. A bottomless well of defiance that seemed to grow stronger the more hopeless the situation became. In that moment of hesitation, Zithora struck. She moved faster than she had any right to move given her wounds, her blade finding the gap in Cathvoran's armor that his arrogance had left unguarded. And the noble fell to the sand with shock frozen on his features. The arena exploded with sound, voices screaming in celebration and fury and disbelief at what they had witnessed. Ethan turned to Zithora, and she was looking at him with wonder written across her ancient face. "You stood against him knowing you would die," she said, and her voice cracked on the words, "I stood for you," he replied. And then his legs finally gave out, and he collapsed to the sand. Zithora caught him before he hit the ground, cradling his broken body against her armor, as if he were the most precious thing in all the galaxy. And then something extraordinary happened. The soul thread that connected them blazed visible in the arena. a cord of pure light that stretched between their hearts and pulsed with power that made even the oldest nobles gasp. The bond was cementing, becoming permanent, becoming something that could never be broken. "He shall be mine," Zithara whispered, echoing the words she had spoken weeks ago. But this time, they held a different meaning. Not a claim of possession, but a declaration of partnership. "And I shall be his, by blood and star, now and forever." The trial was over. The Empress and her human consort had won. 6 months had passed since the trial of Dominion, and the Valkyrie Empire was transforming in ways that even Zithara had not anticipated. Bonding ceremony was broadcast across 900 worlds, and trillions watched as Ethan Cole of Earth became Prince Consort Ethan of House Volkos, the first human in history to hold noble rank in the most powerful empire the galaxy had ever known. He wore robes of deep blue that matched the colors. Zithra's skin shifted to when she was happy, and standing beside her on the dais, he looked nothing like the scared young translator who had arrived on the throne world less than a year ago. The Vir nobles who had opposed the Union watched in silence, their faces masks of careful neutrality that hid whatever plots still stirred behind their compound eyes. But the common people celebrated with joy that echoed through every level of Valkyrie society. Word had spread about the human who treated servants as equals, who had befriended a worker caste woman named Litha and mourned her death as he would mourn family, who had stood against impossible odds not for glory but for love. For the first time in thousands of years, the lower castes had a champion who sat beside the throne. Ethan understood the weight of that responsibility, and he refused to let it go to waste. "We need to change the education laws," he told Zithara during one of their private meetings in the hidden garden where they had first admitted their love. "Every Valkyrie child should have the chance to learn and grow, regardless of what caste they were born into. That will upset the noble houses," she replied, but there was no resistance in her voice, only the careful consideration of a ruler weighing consequences. "Everything worth doing upsets someone," Ethan said with a smile. "Humans learned that a long time ago. The reforms began slowly. Small changes that built upon each other like stones, creating a foundation for something greater. Schools opened in the lower quarters, where they had never existed before, and children who would have spent their lives as invisible servants discovered that they could learn and dream and become something more than their parents had ever imagined. Not everyone welcomed the changes. The traditionalist faction whispered that the human was corrupting their empress, leading her away from the ancient ways that had served the empire for 50,000 years. But every time they tried to organize opposition, they found themselves facing something they had never encountered: genuine popularity. The people loved their prince consort in a way that they had never loved the distant nobles who ruled over them. And that love was a power that could not be bought or threatened or destroyed. Earth sent a formal delegation to celebrate the bonding, and among them was Ethan's family. His mother cried when she saw him, wrapping her arms around his neck and refusing to let go even when protocol demanded. She bowed to the Empress. "I thought I had lost you," she whispered into his shoulder. "I found myself," he replied. "I found everything." The meeting between his mother and Zithara was a moment that Ethan had anticipated with equal parts hope and terror, because these were the two most important women in his life, and the cultural gap between them stretched across galaxies, but he had underestimated both of them. His mother looked at the ancient empress who towered over her small human frame, and instead of fear or reverence, her eyes held the sharp assessment of a woman who had spent 30 years teaching children to see past surfaces to the truth beneath. "You love him," she said, "and it was not a question more than I knew I was capable of loving anything," Zithara replied. And for once her formal tone softened into something vulnerable and real. His mother And then she did something that shocked every Valkyrie in the room. She hugged the impressive Thara, stood frozen for a moment, her forearms hanging uncertainly at her sides, because no one had simply hugged her in 4,000 years. Then, slowly, her arms came up and wrapped around the small human woman who had raised the man she loved. And something that might have been a laugh escaped her lips. "I see where he gets his audacity," she said. "You have no idea," his mother replied with a grin that Ethan recognized all too well. The Galactic Confederation watched the changes in the Valkyrie Empire with a mixture of fascination and concern. A human embedded at the heart of the largest empire changed the balance of power in ways that no one had predicted. And some species feared what it might mean for the future, but others saw hope in what Ethan represented. Proof that the old orders could change and that even the most rigid hierarchies could be softened by the touch of those who believed in something better. Zathara addressed the Galactic Senate 6 months after the bonding ceremony, her voice carrying across a chamber that held representatives from 1,000 species. "We looked upon humanity and saw a young species," she said, her silver eyes sweeping across the assembled delegates, chaotic and brief, barely worth noticing in the grand sweep of galactic history. "We were fools." The chamber fell silent as the most powerful ruler in the galaxy continued. "They are not brief. They are urgent. They love fiercely because they know time is precious. They fight without surrender because they have learned that the impossible is merely the untried. They have taught an empire older than their world that there is strength and compassion and power in treating every being as worthy of respect." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice held a challenge that echoed across light years. "Let the galaxy take note. Humanity is no longer a curiosity to be dismissed. They are the future, and those who fail to see that will be left behind." The speech sent shockwaves through civilizations that had existed for millions of years, forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the upstart species from the little blue planet on Earth. People who had never thought much about their place in the cosmos suddenly found themselves looking at the stars with new eyes. The story of Ethan Cole spread across human space like wildfire, inspiring countless young people to dream of what they might become if they refused to accept the limitations others tried to place upon them. Ethan himself stood on a balcony overlooking the crystal spires of the throne world, watching 3 suns paint the sky in colors that he had come to love as much as the blue of Earth's single sun. Zathara joined him, her presence as familiar now as his own heartbeat, and her hand found his with the ease of long practice. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He smiled, remembering the terrified young man who had stood in this same palace less than a year ago, convinced that his life was over before it had truly begun. "I am thinking about how much has changed," he said. "I came here as the youngest and most inexperienced member of a diplomatic mission, and now I am prince consort of an empire that spans 900 worlds. Do you miss your old life?" she asked, and he could hear the vulnerability beneath the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, because honesty was the foundation upon which they had built everything. "I miss simple things, like coffee and thunderstorms and the way autumn leaves smell when they are falling. But I would not trade what we have for any of it." She squeezed his hand, and her skin shifted to the deep blue that meant happiness. "You have changed my people more than any war or treaty or diplomatic agreement in 10,000 years," she said. "The things you take for granted, kindness and compassion, and the belief that every person has value, they are spreading through the empire like seeds finding fertile ground. Humanity's secret weapon," Ethan said with a grin. "We are apparently very difficult to dislike once people get to know us." "Insufferable is what you are," she replied, but her silver eyes were warm with affection. "And yet here we are," he said. She turned to face him. This ancient being who had ruled worlds before his ancestors learned to make fire. And in her expression he saw something that he would treasure for the rest of his life. The look of someone who had stopped being alone. "Here we are," she agreed. Together, across the galaxy, other species were beginning to look at humans differently. Not as primitives to be dismissed, but as something unexpected and potentially transformative, because humans did not just survive, they changed things. They walked into empires built on hierarchy and treated servants as friends. They faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. They loved with a fierceness that burned through the careful barriers that older species had built. Around their hearts, they were chaos and creativity and stubborn defiance wrapped in fragile bodies that somehow refused to break, and now one of them stood beside the most powerful throne in the galaxy. Proof that the universe was bigger and stranger and more full of possibility than anyone had imagined. The stars stretched out beyond the balcony, ancient and endless and filled with civilizations that were only beginning to understand what humanity might become, and somewhere in that vast expanse, the future was waiting to be written by those brave enough to reach for it. Prince Consort Ethan Cole of House Valkos looked up at those stars with the same wonder he had felt as a child on Earth. And he smiled for a species that was barely evolved. Humanity was doing all right. They were doing all right indeed.